Thank you. Thank you very much, and thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here this morning. It takes about 30 to 40 minutes for caffeine to metabolize, so being on at this time is perfect for me, because you should just be coming to your cognitive best at this point of the day. Normally when I'm doing a session like this, they either put me on just before lunch or about 6 o'clock at night, and the irony is never lost on me. Talk about sleep at a session when people are really struggling to stay awake, but there's no excuse this morning. So, as has just been said, I've been working in this field for about 20 years. I'm not a clinician, I'm a psychologist by background, but I spent the last 15 or so years working with very senior business leaders. Post-PhD, I realized the topic of well-being was something I was really passionate about, particularly in terms of sleep. I was teaching in a university forensic psychology, teaching forensic psychology in prison as well through the Open University, and working with prisoners and understanding that a prison environment is not particularly conducive to good sleep. If any of you have ever been in a prison, and don't worry, you don't have to put your hand up, but if you have, you can just have the inner voice for that one. If you ever have, you'll realize they're not built for sleep. They're hot, they're noisy, prisoners can spend up to 23 hours a day in their bedroom, as it were, in their cell. And yet you're taking already very vulnerable people, individuals, and putting them in an environment where their sleep is very poor. And not surprisingly, we found when we did the research that there was a really quite strong link between aggression and impulsivity and hostility in these people and their poor sleep. And I carried on doing that work for a number of years, and then about 13 or 14 years ago, I moved to a business environment, and very quickly I realized there were a lot of similarities between forensic populations and business populations. So it was a very seamless move into the business world. But working with very senior business leaders, it became very obvious very quickly that this topic of sleep was more pertinent to them possibly than anywhere else, because these senior leaders were operating on ridiculously low amounts of sleep and yet thinking that they could function at a very high level. And I'm here to tell you today that just doesn't happen. You can convince yourself as much as you like that you're okay, but you won't be. And that is a really, really important point. As we lose our sleep, and by losing sleep, I'm only talking about an hour to 2 hours a night, but as we lose that amount of sleep, our ability to have the insight of the effect of that disappears as well. So not only does it reduce our productivity, increase our accidents, reduce our physical health, reduce our cognitive impairments, added to that, we lose the ability to see that effect. So we feel that we're omnipotent, we feel that we're not affected, and that for me is a really critical and potentially quite lethal combination. So let me move to an example. If we can get the slide. Let me give you an example. It's a hypothetical, but it may well have happened to you. So this might be somebody who works for you, who you work with, who's a colleague, who's a boss, but somebody comes along to you and says that they've been struggling with an issue, and they're naming it as alcoholism. They've been struggling for a long time. They've been managing to hide it, but they now feel that it's showing up for them at work. It's starting to affect their job. So you talk to this individual, you talk to John, you find out what's going on for him. You're obviously very supportive as a colleague or as a boss, as an educator. And you ask him how it's showing up for him at work. So he starts to say these kinds of things. He starts to say that his coordination is poor, that he's turning up at work with a headache, that he's finding it difficult to communicate, he can't regulate his emotions, he's sometimes being a bit risky with what he does at work, sometimes he won't make a decision at all. His communication skills are quite poor. Now, as a colleague, as a friend, as a boss, as an educator, as a trainer, whatever you want, however you want to see this relationship, there are probably a number of things that you would do. Firstly, you'd take this really seriously. You would probably say to John, does he have a support network at home? Does he have a support network at work? You might refer him on to occupational health. You might ask him to leave the environment, the hospital, the surgery, wherever he's working, because you might feel that he's actually dangerous and he shouldn't be doing his job. You would make sure he had some counselling available. You'd make sure that he had HR involved. Whatever the appropriate support networks that you think would need to be involved, you would ensure, you would feel it was your responsibility to do that. Now imagine John came to you, and instead of saying he had a problem with alcohol, imagine he said, I'm just really tired. exactly the same effect. That list there is caused by being tired in the same way as it could be caused by turning up to work drunk. And yet, I'm fairly certain your response would not be the same if somebody came to you and said they were just too tired. As I say, I've been working in this field a long time, and I know categorically that people say something along the lines of, we're all tired around here, John, mate, join the club. You know, that's just the nature of the job. Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? I had to do that too, just, you know. Then just some horrible sexist language like, just man up, John, you know. Bit of a wink, bit of a nod. It's just the way we do things around here. It's just what happens. It's just what doing the job involves. So you might even have some sympathy or some empathy, but you're certainly not going to start putting counselling in place or occupational health. You're not going to check his support system. You're not going to do the kind of things that you would do if you're presented with an alcohol problem. But why not? If the outcome, if the effect is exactly the same, and it can be, then what difference does it matter what the cause is? But it's a really important point because organisational culture and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, what is talked about and what isn't talked about, is really, really important. And these kinds of things are often not talked about. So let me put this into context then. 17 hours of wakefulness is the equivalent of having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%. And 24 hours, we start to get to 0.1%, 3, 4, 5 glasses of wine. Would you, honestly, hand on heart, sit and drink a bottle of wine and then go and do some surgery or see a patient or do some training or drive home? Of course you wouldn't. So why would you do this when you are tired if the effect, the outcome, is exactly the same? And just to put this into some context, you would be driving over the legal limit. And yet, how many of us get in the car at the end of a long day at work, get in the car at the end of a shift day at work or shift evening? And yet we could be driving as though we were at least over the limit, if not more than over the limit with alcohol. Something we would never, ever do. We certainly wouldn't do it in the UK anymore. And yet we could be doing this every single day of our working lives. Just some facts and figures there around traffic accidents, particularly within health workers. I was doing a presentation about 6 or 7 weeks ago, and the person that was sharing the stage with me was a medic. And he said that just out of interest, because he knew he was going to be sharing the stage with me, he went and spoke to his colleagues and asked them about near misses or bumps or accidents they'd had after coming off shift. And he said 97% of the people he asked had had a car accident at some point in their medical career, leaving the hospital after the end of a night shift. Now that might just be a little prang as you leave the hospital car park, and it might be much more serious than that. So if we are behaving, and this isn't just about traffic accidents, this is about behaviour all the way across the board. If the effect is the equivalent of being legally over the limit with alcohol, then my challenge is, why aren't we taking it as seriously as we do about drunk driving? Interestingly, if we put this in some kind of context, every human being spends, or should spend, about a third of their life doing this activity. If you don't do it, you die. It doesn't get much more serious than that, does it really? Okay. Don't panic, by the way. It'll take you quite a while to get to that level, but ultimately it can kill you. The body will not allow that to happen. Interestingly, you know, you can starve yourself to death. You can stop drinking and you can die of dehydration. Your body will not allow you to die from sleep deprivation. It will force you to sleep, which is why people fall asleep at the wheel. They don't want to, but their body will force them to do it. So your body will take over your will, and you will get some sleep, because it is seen from a body perspective, from a physiological perspective, as so important. But ultimately, We know there are conditions like fatal familial insomnia that it is fatal always. So this is a critical thing that we need to do. If you sleep for less than 6 hours a night, it increases your mortality risk by 13%. Sleeping for 6 or less hours a night regularly increases your risk of death by 13%, and that is after all other factors that might influence your mortality have been controlled for. So we know that isolating sleep, or more importantly, lack of it, can increase mortality. It's linked to 7 of the 15 top 2 causes of death. So just to give you a bit more information on those 2 facts, even if you're feeling particularly smug and you think, well, I don't sleep less than 6 hours, I get maybe 6.5 to 7, you're still on that 7% risk. Okay? It is that critically important. Those 7 of 15 causes of death, things like cardiovascular disease, accidents, diabetes, high blood pressure, and I'm going to give you some information about that in a minute. These are huge longitudinal studies conducted over many, many years with thousands and thousands of participants. And yet they show that even if we start to control for all of the other risk factors, sleep is the one thing that comes back time and time and time again. So I guess my challenge to you is this. Given that you as an individual, the people that you work with as individuals should be spending 1/3 of their life doing it, if you don't do it at all, you die. And if you do it ineffectively, it has cognitive, physical, social, and organizational costs. Then why don't we talk about this stuff? Interestingly, getting better sleep doesn't cost anybody anything. We can all do it. We have all been trained to do it. I don't have to go and spend a huge amount of money in technological infrastructure to do it. I don't have to train people to do it. Everybody inherently has the ability to make that change. And that's hugely empowering, but also for somebody like me, it's hugely frustrating because there is no reason for most people why we can't actually take this seriously and make a change. So given we are where we are, then what is the impact of not taking this seriously? Well, let's look at the physical costs. So firstly, hypertension. What's really interesting about hypertension is that we have a U-shaped curve in that both short sleep and what they class as long sleep have been related to hypertension. On one study, it has been found that just one night of poor sleep, one night of broken sleep, can increase systolic blood temperature between 5 and 10, a figure of 5 and 10. Now, next night goes back to normal. That's not an issue. But if you imagine that's chronic, night after night after night after night after night, you can see why hypertension is strongly related. The data now is not in dispute. The data, the link between poor sleep and high blood pressure, linking then to cardiovascular disease, is extremely powerful. Obesity is also now being started to link to poor sleep. So the hormones that regulate appetite get completely thrown out of whack when we get poor quality sleep or not enough sleep. So that our ability to notice that we're full reduces and our desire to eat inappropriate food or food that's often high sugar and high fat increases. And if you add that to the fact that when we are tired, we lose our willpower, you can see how it's a perfect storm for obesity. We don't feel full physiologically. Our desire to eat high sugar, high carb, high fat food increases, and our willpower to say no to pizza disappears. And that's why we know it's been linked to obesity in children and in adults. And also adult onset type 2 diabetes. Again, a very, very strong link between this and poor sleep. And this has been shown even when they control for all other risk factors that have been linked to type 2 diabetes. Let's move on to cognitive costs then. Now, interestingly, the physical costs, some of those might take a few years to build up. Some of them are very, very quick. It only takes 2 weeks of poor sleep, and I'm not talking about total sleep deprivation, just an hour or so, perhaps less a night than you need, or multiple wakings in a night. Only a couple of weeks, and then your risk of cold increases by between 3 and 5 times. You're 3 to 5 times more likely to catch the common cold if you are tired. Now, then you add that to flu symptoms, low-lying stomach bugs, and all of those kind of low-level immune system. You can see how people can constantly almost be fighting off infection if you are constantly tired. The cognitive effects doesn't take a few weeks or a few months or a few years. The cognitive effects of poor sleep appear after one night. One night of getting between an hour to an hour and a half less sleep than you need, and your cognitive performance decreases. You might not know it, you might not believe it, you might convince yourself otherwise, or you might be so super bright that losing a bit of cognitive ability doesn't really matter. However, it will reduce. One night of poor sleep. So if we can just go back to the slides, thank you. So one night of poor sleep and your memory performance decreases. We know, ironically, although we do this every night, we know very little about how sleep works and why we sleep, other than it's critical for survival. But the one thing we really do know about cognitive performance is that memory is absolutely linked to sleep. Our memory consolidation, so consolidating our memory, storing it in our brain, sleep is absolutely critical for that to be done effectively. The research around memory and sleep shows that if you learn some material and then you take an hour and a half nap, that is more effective at learning that material than doing anything else in that hour and a half, including revising the material. The hour and a half of a nap, which is enough to go round one entire sleep cycle, consolidates that information. So ironically, often when we're under pressure, we're revising for some exams, we've got a presentation, whatever it is we're learning, we tend to stay up to do it. That is absolutely counterintuitive to successful learning and memory. And it's not just about content, it's just not about knowledge, because motor control is also memory. Riding a bike, playing the piano, it relies on memory. And motor coordination and motor control is critical, absolutely critically linked to sleep. So there, for example, a 20% increase in motor performance after only one night of good sleep. And that still has an effect, even if that sleep comes 12 hours after you've learned that new motor skill. So it doesn't have to be immediate. There is something about it. And if you think about, as practicing medics, how much of what you do may rely on motor coordination. Absolutely critical. Decision making. We all make decisions all the time, some of them more significant than others. Decision making, memory, innovation, creativity, problem solving, high-level communication skills, all are grouped together in something called executive functions. They sit in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. That's the hardest working area of the brain when we're awake. And it's the area of the brain that is most vulnerable to sleep deprivation. If we scan patients, we see that when they're really tired, there's just significantly less activity in the prefrontal cortex. It is just destroyed by poor sleep. Poor sleep meaning one night of not enough sleep. So any activity that relies on the prefrontal cortex, like memory, attention, perception, creativity, innovation, decision-making, problem-solving, high-level communication skills, things that we use every day in leadership positions, they get destroyed extraordinarily quickly. And don't forget, you don't have the insight into it. So, the Challenger space shuttle disaster. Most of you, showing my age now, because some of you perhaps don't remember it, but those of you that do, catastrophic disaster. And the official report, so this is open source, you can read it on the internet. The official report done after the disaster said that, quote, working excessive hours whilst admirable raises serious questions when it jeopardizes job performance, particularly when critical management decisions are at stake. The official report of the Challenger space shuttle disaster confirmed that decisions were made by highly competent, highly trained individuals, but those were really bad decisions. Bad decisions that led to deaths. These were not people that lacked the training. They were not people that lacked the technology. They were not people that lacked the infrastructure. They were working for NASA. They were highly intelligent, highly skilled people with high amounts of technological and resources available to them. But they made really poor decisions. And they made poor decisions because they'd been working split shifts. They'd been on at 1 o'clock in the morning on the day they made the decision, and they made a decision they would never, ever have made if they hadn't been tired. 3 Mile Island, Exxon Valdez, Chernobyl. Again, all catastrophic accidents, human and environmental, and all have been found to have a link to poor decisions on the back of sleep. Not having enough sleep. Not recognizing changes in the environment. Not being able to act quickly. Not being able to act in a flexible, innovative way. Basically, that divergent thinking, so thinking outside of the box, that falls down remarkably quickly with poor sleep. Convergent thinking, doing the same thing most of the time, 1 and 1 is 2, 1 and 1 is 2, that actually is relatively resistant to sleep. It takes about 36 to 40 hours of total sleep deprivation before convergent thinking falls down. So it isn't impervious, but it does take a while. Divergent thinking, the stuff that we rely on more and more doing the kinds of jobs that you do, falls down within 1 night of poor sleep. If you want to put this into some more context, not only does divergent thinking fall down, but we often become more confident in the decisions that we make. So we're making poorer decisions, we are lacking the insight into it being a poor decision, and we become more confident in that decision. Not a good mix, is it? And if you think about it, you are all in senior leadership positions. You have people that look to you. If you make a decision that you are confident in and you sound confident in, who is going to question it? So you can see how these things start to unravel. So I looked at some research looking specifically at medics just to show how these things do unravel. So compared to a 16-hour shift, a doctor on a 24-hour shift makes twice as many attentional failures, 5 times as many serious diagnostic errors, 36% more serious medical errors, 300% more fatigue-related medical errors that led to a death of a patient, 61% more needle stick and other sharps injuries, and about 1.5 to 2 standard deviations deterioration in their performance on both clinical and non-clinical tasks. If you saw that without the top line and you said, doing this thing, whatever this thing is, increases your risk of medical errors by 36%, increases your risk of a clinical decision leading to a patient's death by 300%, you wouldn't ask anybody to do this thing, would you? You'd say, whatever it is, don't do it. This is absolutely catastrophic for our practice. And yet, we are doing it day in, or more importantly, night in, night out, across the UK. And then we are surprised often, or perhaps not surprised, by the results. What are our interpersonal costs then? So physically it's not a good idea, cognitively it's not a good idea. What about interpersonal costs? I think this is a really interesting quote by Bill Clinton. He said in 2007, you have no idea how many Republican and Democratic members of the House and Senate are chronically sleep deprived because of the system. I know this is an unusual theory, but I do believe sleep deprivation has a lot to do with some of the edginess of Washington today. Now, I appreciate that was 2007. I can't imagine anything has changed. I know Donald Trump very proudly says that he only needs 4 hours of sleep a night. I shall not comment. What's also interesting is around about the same time, Bill Clinton, after he finished his presidency, he was asked a question which was, if you were to have your time again, what one thing would you do differently? And interestingly, we all know what Bill Clinton did do, allegedly, while he was president. And yet the one thing that he said he wished he'd done differently, he said, I wish I'd slept more. Now, that wasn't slept with somebody more, just slept. But the point is that of all the things he could have said, that was the one thing he chose. I wish I could have slept more. And I think that really puts into perspective the interpersonal costs. When we have poor sleep, our relationships fall down. We can't regulate our mood. We can't read facial expressions very effectively. We lack that ability to notice micro-expressions, so our sympathy and our empathy reduces. We start to build barriers to protect ourselves. We start to become socially isolated. And interestingly, a piece of research that came out 2 or 3 weeks ago now in a medical journal said there's now a piece of research that says that social isolation is actually contagious. So the individuals who were sleep deprived were feeling socially isolated, but the individuals who were observing that sleep deprivation also started to feel socially isolated too. So not only is this affecting you as an individual or the colleagues that you work with, but actually there might be a contagion effect as well, in that just feeling that social isolation might have a ripple effect across the organisation. It also means that we see the world in a negative way. We have this negative bias, okay? On the slide where I talked about memory, you may have noticed that although our memory falls down, the one thing that we can still remember when we're tired is negative events. So the positive and the neutral events we struggle to remember when we're tired, but the negative events we hold on to, interestingly. And that is then exacerbated by the fact that when we are tired, we see everything through a very negative lens. And not only does that, but poor sleep actually increases our anxiety, our depression, and our subjective well-being. And it doesn't have to be nights and nights of no sleep. These kind of effects happen after one night of being woken up 4 times for a total of 10 minutes. Who hasn't had a night's sleep when they've woken up 4 times for 10 minutes? That's all this takes. So, the research I do, I'm not talking about army-level sleep deprivation studies of weeks and weeks of no sleep. I'm talking about regular, disrupted nights of sleep. Fundamentally, what happens to our emotions if we have something called an amygdala hijack? So the amygdala is part of the brain that regulates emotion. It heightens the kind of fight or flight. It's the survival mechanism. And then we have the sensible prefrontal cortex that regulates that and says, actually, you probably don't need to run screaming. There's no lions. It's just a presentation. You'll be fine. And those two normally talk to each other quite effectively. When we're under a huge amount of pressure, the amygdala sometimes takes over and we fight, fright, or freeze. Most of the time, the prefrontal cortex talks. What we know is a night or 2 of poor sleep, and that conversation between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala disappears. Scanning studies shows that neuronal connection between those parts of the brain just disappears. There is no activity there. What that means is the prefrontal cortex is reduced in effectiveness, the amygdala takes over. So not only do we have heightened negative emotion, but it means our emotions aren't regulated at all. So you do that. So everything is either amazing or disastrous, amazing or disastrous, and there's no kind of happy medium. So those of you that can think back to your own personal experiences when you've been really tired, you probably have felt on a real roller coaster. Either you're feeling the best you ever had, 5 minutes later, oh, the world's ending, next 5 minutes you're good again. Now that's quite frustrating for you, but imagine working with you. What a nightmare. Okay, next slide. So what are the economic costs of this? This figure, I think, is absolutely astounding. This was based on a study done in 2016 by RAND. And what they said is that the reduction in productivity caused by poor sleep and the increase in absenteeism caused by sleep means that in the UK, the number of people who aren't getting the required 7 to 9 hours sleep a night is costing the UK economy between 25 and 36 billion pounds a year. So let's put that in context. I am basically saying to you that if every single working age adult in the UK slept between 7 to 9 hours a night, we could save the UK economy between 25 and 36 billion pounds every single year. And don't forget, this doesn't cost anything. We can all do it. We can all go away and do it tonight, hypothetically, for those of you not on shift. But the point is, it's a relatively easy fix in the grand scheme of the world today, and that is the economic cost. So, it makes us very, very ill. It means that cognitively we're not at our best. It means interpersonally we're not at our best. And it is costing the economy a vast amount of money. So why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we sleeping those 7 to 9 hours a night? Interestingly, in 2015 was the first time that organisations such as the National Sleep Foundation and the American Sleep Foundation came out and said there are designated categories of how much sleep we need. So for a healthy adult, we're looking at round about 7 to 9 hours a night. Now that is wide, 7 to 9 hours, and of course it is hugely variable. Absolutely. There are people at one end of the normal distribution that need less and at the other that need more. However, for those of you thinking, well, 4 or 5 hours a night, I'm okay, I'm surviving, there is a big difference between surviving and thriving. A big difference. And also don't forget that idea that as you get more sleep deprived, your insight and your ability to see the effect decreases dramatically. Interestingly, quite a famous prolific sleep researcher in the States said that the number of people that need less than 6 hours a night, genuinely only need less than 6 hours a night of sleep, is so small that if we rounded it up, it would round to 0. So I think that says a lot about what we need versus what we convince ourselves we think is okay. And I'm saying it isn't. It absolutely isn't okay. So just to talk to you very briefly then about how big this issue is around about 16% of the UK workforce is getting less than 6 hours a night. This is a big issue. And around about 19 are getting between 6 and 7 hours a night. So we're looking at about 35% of the adult workforce in the UK in that potential quite serious effect zone. And if you think about the jobs that you do, they might not show up, these individuals, with poor sleep. They might show up with low-level infections or cardiovascular issues or diabetes or as a result of a car accident, and on and on and on and on. But fundamentally, if we can address this, maybe we can address other things or cut them off at the pass. I thought it might be just very useful very quickly to just explain to you a little bit about how sleep works, because I think that really then starts to think about what you can do about it. So fundamentally, sleep works in 2 ways. We have a circadian rhythm, which is 24 hours, and we have a drive to sleep, which is linear. So the process S, which is our sleep drive, is linear. That is, the longer we stay awake, the more tired we are. If I wake up in the morning and I've had a good night's sleep, I'm not tired at all. By lunchtime, I'm starting to get a little bit fatigued. By the end of the day, I'm ready for bed. It's purely linear. The longer we stay awake, the more tired we get. As a completely separate system, so these systems don't talk to each other, they're entirely independent, is our circadian rhythm, our 24-hour cycle. Our drive for sleep is determined by the chemical adenosine, which is secreted in the system. The buildup of adenosine increases. The more we have in the system, the more tired we get. For those of you interested in caffeine, what happens with caffeine is it blocks the uptake of adenosine, so we think we're less tired. Adenosine is still secreted, so that when caffeine is burnt off, the body suddenly realizes, whoa, I'm really, really tired, which is why you often get the crash after the caffeine. The 24-hour cycle is driven entirely independently of how tired we are. It just goes on a 24-hour cycle. And in fact, it's entirely driven internally, and the cycle is actually about 24 and a half hours. So if I sent you all off to live in a cave for a few weeks without any external light at all, your 24-hour cycle is actually about 24 and a half hours. And that is really important because it means that in order for us to live in a 24-hour society, we use light and dark that regulates our 24-hour cycle. So it keeps bringing our 24 and a half hours into alignment to 24. Now, in a perfect world, we wake up in the morning, we're wide awake, and the sun is up. Over the course of the day, the 24-hour cycle moves along at the same time as we get tired. So by the time we get to the night, it's dark, we're tired, we go to sleep. Simple. But often it isn't. Because what happens with people doing shift work? Most of you will be very experienced about that. What happens then, of course, is that we might be completely exhausted because we've gotten to the end of a night shift and we've been up all night, but it's bright sunlight out there. So our 24-hour cycle is saying, wake up, and our sleep drive is saying, I'm exhausted. There's a mismatch. Or the opposite. You're going to shift, you're going to work at night, so you've been in bed all day, you've not had too bad sleep, so you're quite awake. But our 24-hour cycle is saying, but it's dark, and we should be asleep. So you can see straight away how the mismatch between the circadian rhythms and the drive for sleep causes so many problems. The other thing to pay attention to is that it's both quality and quantity of sleep that are important. So yes, the 7 to 9 hours is important, but also we need to get the deep sleep as much as the light sleep. And that's really important. Often people are focused on deep sleep and thought that is critical. Yes, it is. But we now know actually that REM sleep, dream sleep, is just as important, particularly interesting for memory. If we wake people up as they're going into dream sleep, the memory consolidation processes often don't work. So what that means is it's not just about getting your 7 to 9 hours, it's getting that quality of sleep as well, going through all the different stages at the different times of the night. One of the things to note, obviously, there is that you'll notice that you get more deep sleep in the first half of the night than the second half of the night. And that's really important when you're starting to think about how you can make some changes. Because napping, if you're on a night shift, napping can be really, really effective, particularly if you nap in the first half of your night shift. Because if you nap in the first half of your night shift, you're more likely to get deeper sleep, and that is more likely to keep you refreshed for the second half of the night. If you nap in the second half of the night, I appreciate that's probably when you're more tired, but you're likely to get less deep sleep, so it's less likely to have a beneficial effect. So understanding the two drives, the two systems, and understanding the quality and the quantity, I think you can then really start to think about what do I need to do differently. Thinking about light regulation. Temperature is another one. Temperature hugely affects the quality of your sleep. We fall asleep when our core body temperature is very slightly below normal. So when our core body temperature is dropping dramatically is when we get the most tired. But ironically, the way to get that to drop quickly is to warm up your distal, so your hands and feet. So whilst it might not be the sexiest look in the world, bed socks are really good, okay? I might ruin marriages, but I'll get you good sleep. But by warming up your distal, so your hands and your feet, actually that encourages your core body temperature to decrease and actually can encourage sleep. It's one of the reasons why warm showers and warm baths also sometimes help too. So these kinds of things are really important to start to understand how you can basically improve the sleep. So what I'd like to do just as a summary then before we take some questions is just say that if we are in a situation where we know that our alertness is similar to being drunk, where we get increased negative mood and a negative bias on seeing the world, if we lose the ability to regulate our emotions, if we can't communicate effectively and show empathy, if we don't have ability to learn knowledge or skills, we make poor decisions, we become more risky in those decisions, we become overconfident in those decisions, we can't think flexibly and innovatively, and ultimately it can kill us, then my challenge to you is we should be doing this more and taking this more seriously and talking to people about the impact of this, because sleep is absolutely critical, not just for survival, but for thriving. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks. I did say it was life-changing, really. And we've got some mics, and we're going to ask for questions. And whilst we're just sorting those out, and you may be thinking, I guess I'd like to start. I mean, it is a pretty scary message for us, really. I mean, everyone in this room has worked over hours, and you know, in our own lives, and as doctors, we see people who are in caring roles can't sleep. So I guess I'd just start by asking a bit about what we can do, and what are the things that would help.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things. I think for me, the first thing is being aware it's an issue. And that sounds a bit trite, but actually it's so important because so many people will convince themselves there's other things happening. Because, you know, if I eat bad seafood, I vomit straight afterwards. So cause and effect is so clear. With poor sleep, it's so easy to use other reasons for the effect. So I think firstly, it's taking this seriously. And I think secondly, you've got to be pragmatic. You know, people have lives to lead, they have jobs to do, they have care, you know, in a caring profession, they have children. So it's understanding about what you have control over and what you don't. And that's really important. Control is a massive psychological mechanism for well-being. The more we feel in control, often the more well we feel. So I think it's really about thinking about, I can't control if my children wake up in the middle of the night, but I can control this and I can control that. And I think that is the first step, thinking about what you can do. And also choices. So a sleep researcher who I have a lot of respect for says, if you ever have a choice between doing anything else and sleep, always choose sleep. Which I think, you know, I mean, pragmatically, I'm not suggesting you don't go to work and you just sleep. But he was saying, if you say, you know, should I go out for dinner with my friends or I really need some sleep, sleep. If it's, should I go to the gym for an hour or sleep, he says that sleep is so critical, it outweighs the benefit of any of those kinds of activities.
Good. Thank you. And I mean, I'm going to give a plug to your book, really, because actually in the book you talk quite a lot at the end of each of the chapters after you scared yourself about what's going to happen, about what you might do, really. And,
yeah, absolutely. I've tried very hard to not send everybody into terror. I don't get invited to a lot of parties.
Yeah, and I think my colleagues would probably note that I've stopped sending emails at 11 o'clock at night, actually, because I'm a good girl now. Okay, so have we got questions from the audience? If you'd like to raise your hand.
There's a question.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Vicki. I'm Omi Narayan. I'm one of the sleep consultants in pediatric medicine, and you have put it like fantastically.
Thank you.
I must say that when I was doing my training in pediatrics in London, there was a massive culture change. So in terms of when we were doing our residency, all the beds were removed, all the sofas were removed in night shift, that doctors are being paid for this 12-hour shift. How can you be allowed to take a nap for 1 hour or 2 hours or 3 hours? You're being paid. So in the mess, all the beds were removed. I must say, with the emphasis on sleep, many people and many of the postgraduate deaneries, they are taking this and they're bringing the, I'm not asking for a bed or so, but what I'm saying, that the trainees are allowed, if they take a nap, even for 1 hour, 30 minutes, that makes their decision-making skills so much better. And that's what, I don't know how many hospitals they allow their trainees to take a nap, but I think there is a need for this culture change.
Absolutely agree with you. I completely agree with you. You know, from a non-sleep expert perspective, yes, it makes logical sense to say we're paying somebody for 12 hours. I want to see 12 hours of work. But I would rather have 11 hours of a doctor's time knowing that they've slept well and they're making good decisions than 12 hours of a doctor's time when they haven't. And it's great to see that hopefully that culture change is moving back. Yeah, but these kind of events as well make a massive difference, which is why I'm so excited to be here, because this is where change happens, I guess.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a question up at the back over there, or raised hand there. Behind you, over there. Another one there. Okay, yeah. And it's great if you introduce yourself as well. That would be lovely before you start.
Hello, I am Ira Vermani. I'm one of the anesthetic consultants in MRI. Really very good talk, thank you very much, and I'll take my sleep seriously now. Basically, I wanted to ask you about daytime nap. You know, people who can afford it, like sleeping, having a nap after a few hours. Do you think it can benefit with the lack of sleep you have in the night? That's my first question. And then I just want to ask you regarding the quality of sleep. Is there any way of knowing? I mean, obviously we know that we have slept well and we are doing okay, but is there any other way of knowing that we have had a good night's sleep and a quality sleep? Because quality is very difficult to define as such, and especially when we are asleep, and we cannot really judge, isn't it? Because during daytime also, we can't exactly judge quality of things we do. So what about the sleep?
Okay, right, so let's take napping first.
Okay.
So fundamentally, as a human being, we should be able to survive 12 hours of being awake without taking a nap. So the first thing to think about is if you do feel tired enough to take a nap, is either habit or you're not getting enough sleep. But I am a great believer that if your body tells you to take a nap, then you need a nap. The key thing about napping is firstly, if you think about that sleep cycle, it takes about 15 minutes to go from wakefulness into the first stage of light sleep. It's just how long it takes us to relax and fall into light sleep. About an hour and a half to go round an entire cycle and come out to light sleep. So with a nap, the worst thing you can do is wake up in the middle of deep sleep. You know, on a Saturday afternoon when you've fallen asleep on the sofa and you wake up and you don't know where you are and you don't know what day it is and you've normally dribbled sexily down your chin and you wake up and you think, I actually feel worse than I did before I went to sleep. And that's because you've woken up in deep sleep. So the thing about a nap is you either need to do about 15 minutes, which is the light sleep, or an entire cycle, an hour and a half. So you wake up again in light sleep. Waking up in deep sleep, often you will feel worse than you did before. The other thing about napping is, if you remember, the drive for sleep increases as you get nearer night. Napping doesn't reset it back to zero, but it actually reduces your drive for sleep a little bit. So if you nap too close to bedtime, it actually becomes self-defeating, because you then go to bed and you're not tired enough and you stay awake and then you need another nap the next night and it becomes cyclical. So the peak time in an ideal world of having a nap is around about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, which is when you have that perfect dip and you're tired anyway, and it's not close enough to bedtime to have a big effect. And you either need to have 15 minutes, which has an effect like meditation, or an hour and a half, which will have that amazing effect on your memory as well, in an ideal world. The quality of sleep, polysomnography, you can go and wire yourself up in a sleep lab, costs a fortune, don't bother. The other way of doing it is getting something like an iWatch, an app on your phone. They're not perfect by any means, and if you read the literature, there's a whole range of literature that says how good or bad they are. But as a rough guide to quality of sleep, they're not a bad start. And as technology improves, we're going to get cheaper and cheaper access to better and better quality of measuring quality of sleep. They use a variety of things. So some of them will use movement. So those on your phone will use movement as a proxy for the sleep stages. Some of them, like the iWatch, will use your pulse rate and movement together in tandem. They're not perfect, but I say they'll give you a good feeling. But actually, fundamentally, if you wake up in the morning and you feel good, give yourself a couple of minutes to come round and then ask yourself your question, how do I feel, good or bad? If the majority of the time over a working week you're saying good, you're probably getting the right quality and the right quantity, because you should be waking up in a morning and feeling refreshed. And if you do, that's normally as good an indicator as ever that you're probably getting the right amount and the right quality.
Thank you very much. That was very useful.
Okay,
pleasure.
yeah, question over there. Yeah, that one.
Wanted
Yep.
to quickly
Yes.
ask you about alarm. Can
Oh,
disturb your
sorry.
sleep.
We didn't hear that.
That's what happens when you give somebody the mic there. That's it. Sorry, setting an alarm.
It can disturb your sleep either in the first phase or in the deep phase. Will that matter then?
The best time to wake up is in the light sleep, because in an ideal world without an alarm, our body has built so that it will naturally wake up in light sleep. Setting the alarm in the deep sleep is when it becomes really difficult to wake up and you're very groggy. So some of the technology these days, some of the lights, Philips do a light where you actually set the alarm and it also reads which sleep cycle you're in. So if you set the alarm, let's say for 6 o'clock in the morning, and it can tell that you're just about to go into deep sleep, it will wake you up slightly earlier than 6 because it knows actually you'll wake up better than if it let you go into deep sleep and wake up at 6.
Okay. Thank you.
I've never used one myself, but the feedback I've had from clients that have said it really, really effective.
Okay, a great question there. I think you've got one. Yeah.
Hi Vicki, my name is Melanie Caplew. I'm a consultant in dental public health in Lancashire, and I have questions which I don't think relate particularly to dentistry. But I pose 2 questions. The first about, could you make a comment on sleep and how it's affected by the menopause?
Yes.
And secondly, could I ask you for some advice about how we should handle jet lag?
Right, okay. The comment on sleep in the menopause is, yes, sleep is affected by the menopause. Move on. Yes. Hugely affected. So, interestingly, there are big differences between men and women generally, but particularly around hormones. So, pregnancy, postpartum, menopause, menstruation as well, in fact, have big effects. The general feeling around the menopause is there is very little you can do because it is so driven by hormones that it's all just almost a hormonal clash. The melatonin is secreting to fall asleep and you're having the night flushes and those kind of things. But it's absolutely, there's lots and lots of research out there that says during that menopausal period, women can suffer really quite significantly with poor sleep. Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, very rarely talked about, but it's a huge issue, very much so, yeah. And the second one, jet lag. Yes, so the thing about jet lag is a little bit like shift work. It's that separation of those two drives that becomes the issue. The first thing is that if you get off the plane and your body is telling you you should be asleep, but the light is telling you it's the middle of the day, you need to do everything you can to reset your circadian rhythm to tell you it's the middle of the day. So rather than going straight to the hotel and then having quite a dark hotel room, get out into the light, get as much sunlight onto your retina as possible, get as much temperature and warmth onto your body as possible, because that just speeds up the resetting of the circadian rhythm. The same the other way round. So if you arrive at a time when you're wide awake, but it should be the night, go to the hotel, put the lights on dim, so don't have bright lights. So use all the external cues that you can to align your rhythms as quickly as possible. It's always easier to push your bedtime forward than bring it back, so it's always easier to stay awake when you're tired than try and go to sleep when you're not tired. So if you're in that position where you can either push on for a few hours or go to bed, always try and push on. The other thing you can try is the minute that you get on the plane is operate at the same time as you would do disembarkation, which often means that you perhaps need to bring your own meals and kind of earplugs and blackout glasses, but actually it gives your body that extra 9, 10, 11 hours to adjust. But interestingly, it takes between 24 and 36 hours for your body to adjust for every single time zone, and a time zone is an hour. So it's taking 24 or 36 hours for every hour. And often we don't even think about jet lag when we're traveling around Europe, but actually it's still having a physiological effect. So I think also there's something about giving yourself a break, because often I think we go, particularly if it's on holiday, and we don't even allow ourselves, we can't possibly have jet lag, we're here on holiday. I think sometimes it's just about accepting that it will take a few days, but the quicker that you can align those two systems, the better.
Okay, thank you. We've got a question at the back over there.
Yeah, hi, I'm Richard Morgan, I'm DME in Lancashire Care. This is an observation really rather than a question, but interestingly, I received a request stroke demand from a local MP yesterday with a response time of yesterday to know whether we're self-assessing within our trust against some recommendations and guidelines around fatigue and sleep. And I think that's originally come from the Royal College of Anaesthetists, and it's on the back of an anaesthetic trainee who died in a car crash on the way home from a shift. Fortunately, we have actually started some work in our trust to review where we're up to about fatigue and in response to shifts. We're not actually using those guidelines, but we're using some from the BMA Charter around sleep and fatigue, and also using some recommendations from the Royal College of Psychiatrists. We're primarily a mental health trust. So it was really just to say that there are various recommendations and guides and self-assessment tools out there.
That's absolutely brilliant to hear. I mean, yeah, like all MPs demanding and wanting it yesterday, but the fact that it's even on people's radars is really great.
Is there another question over here now?
Hi. I'm Anne Holden. I'm a senior educator at Southport, and I'm also a consultant anaesthetist. The Royal College of Anaesthetists and the Association of Anaesthetists have actually been talking about this for some time, and actually they have some resources about sort of, if you like, warning signs for trainees to identify themselves if they're at risk before they drive home, and they're available for anybody. So if you go to the Association of Anaesthetists website, there are a number of resources there that you can utilise basically to help people recognise fatigue and also to increase the profile.
That's brilliant. And I think the really important point there is about other people recognising it, because as I say, you just lose that ability to have insight into your own behaviour. So if other people are trained to recognise it in others, I think that's really helpful.
Good. We've got another one there.
Idris Khalid, consultant cardiologist at Fairfield. Two minor points. One is there is an increasing recognition of atrial fibrillation with obstructive sleep apnea. And that may be related to excessive sleep, although it's not normal, but there is a higher risk of that. And the second point is that is there a difference between going to sleep naturally or sleeping with the help of melatonin type tablets or some other sleeping tablets?
There is. With melatonin, the thing about using melatonin, of course, is that because it is a naturally secreted hormone, getting the levels right and the timing right often takes a lot of practice. Also, a lot of the research around melatonin has not looked at long-term effects. So, we're still quite behind the curve in terms of research around the effect of that. With sleeping tablets, what you can often find is that the sleep cycles are not as clear as they could be with natural sleep. So you'll often find that people will say that they've had the right amount of sleep, but the quality of their sleep hasn't been as good. Sometimes people report that they almost feel like they've kind of been hit over the head and then shaken awake. So that natural waking up into light sleep seems to, for some people, disappear with sleeping tablets. So I think you still get some of the curve, but it sometimes goes a little flatter and you don't get quite as clean, deep and light sleep. You get the stages, but it's not quite as refreshing as natural sleep. I think melatonin, we're going to take probably another 5 or 6 years before we really understand the timing and the impact of that. And I think that's also related to chronotype. So a piece of research that came out last week is now saying that researchers are now developing ways of measuring through blood tests what an individual's chronotype is. And I think that linked to melatonin research will be really, really effective. And also the use of medication, because what the really interesting thing about chronotype is it will tell you the best time to take medication for the most effective for your own system. And these researchers are now saying that within 2 or 3 years, it will actually be really cheap to be able to test your own chronotype.
Jane?
Jane Mamlock, Postgraduate Dean. It's really an observation at the highest level. My experience is the work that we've done around improving junior doctors' working lives and the implementation of the new contract, which will address a lot of these issues about how long people work, their breaks, that sort of thing. Trusts and HRDs are fully engaged with that, as we've seen from the work around the sort of guardians and safe working hours. But there is a sort of clash and a dissonance between the expectation of the service. And this issue is not just junior doctors, it's across the whole service. So if you've got people, basically you're having to bring in other staff to backfill where you've got rota gaps, they reach a point where there isn't enough money in the system to allow that. And I was really interested what you were saying about at a political level the effects of sleep deprivation, because I think part of the problem is the different parts of the system don't talk to each other. So we have massive demands on the service and raised expectations around, say, the 4-hour wait, the management of winter pressures, which actually requires us to have a lot more feet on the ground doing the jobs. And actually the people making those critical decisions at political level may be sleep deprived themselves.
Absolutely.
And then
yes.
lack the insight. And actually just throwing more money at the system, more doctors, I'm a GP by background, but 5,000 more GPs won't deliver if what you actually want is more people to be able to access primary care services. You need, yes, maybe 5,000 GPs, but you need lots of people across the whole system. And I just, you know, we at senior level are trying to engage at political level to get an understanding of what does this actually mean to deliver a safe service. But I was really interested. The sleep deprivation is there at political level
Absolutely,
as well.
it really is. And I think it's that short-termism versus sustainability. So 5,000 GPs that burn out after 2 years is no good. You'd rather, I'm sure, have 1,000 that can stick it for 30. So it's that sustainability piece. The political one is really interesting. So I don't really remember, but at the height of the Euro crisis, Angela Merkel called a meeting of all of the leaders of the European economies. And this was the point when it was stated in Reuters that it was the most critical point in the history of Europe post-Second World War, because it was the point when the euro was about to crash. So everybody came together and they met at 10 o'clock at night. And the meeting went throughout the night. And when I came to work the next morning, I'd got about 15 emails from the BBC and also saying, comment on this, because, you know, it's Europe. They didn't have to fly around the world. They could have just met, you know, in a regular day. And call me a cynic, but they had dinner before they started, and I bet they weren't drinking water at that dinner. So in the most critical meeting of the history of Europe, they had dinner, had a few glasses of wine, and then started to have a conversation at 10 o'clock at night and finished, I think, at 4 o'clock in the morning. I mean, it's just that kind of behaviour that begs the question about, you know, the lack of insight. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've got a question there and then we'll come here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Clara Lee. I'm one of the A&E consultants from Whiston Hospital. Thank you, really interesting talk. I was just wondering whether you had, there was any research around thinking about sort of full shift patterns and how to make a sustainable rota, whether there was any research that had gone into thinking about how doctors can go safely from day mode to late mode to night mode, and which way round it was better to do that.
Yeah, there is, and I'm going to talk, so I'm doing a workshop later on, we're doing one together. I'm going to focus a little bit more on shift work, because I want to think about practically what can people do. But there are a number of things. So firstly, age is hugely related to the effects of shift. So as we get older, we naturally become less adaptable to shift work patterns. So I think there's something about just bearing in mind people's age. There's some really interesting work around choice and shifts, that psychologically people will adapt more to shift work if they feel they haven't had an active choice in that, whatever that shift work is. There's something around chronotype. So about 20% of us are naturally larks or naturally owls. And I think it's ironic that we never ask those questions when we think about shift work. Maybe some people are naturally predisposed to do lates or earlies or whatever it happens to be. So something around that. And I think also there is something around, if we are, our natural cycle is 24.5 hours. So we're naturally going at 24.5 hours, which is why it's better to push shifts forward than bring them back. So moving from mornings to afternoons to evenings to nights. So I think there are some things we can talk about, and I'm happy to talk about that in more detail. There are some things we can do. And I think also then there is the kind of care at the end, which is when people are working long hours, doing shifts and are tired, you have other people checking in that they are safe to drive home, that they aren't making mistakes. Because the minute we do get tired, we do lose that insight. So I think there are really practical things we can do. And then pragmatically, because as we know, we're working within the framework we've got, there are other things and kind of safety checks that I don't think are there as well as they could be at this point in time. But I'm happy to have a more detailed conversation about some of those things we could do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got a question here. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Raj Parak. I'm a geriatrician from Oldham. I just wondered, the use of tablet devices and things with the brightness of the lights affecting people's sleep patterns?
It's a really good point, and yes, they are. So the latest research suggests that using blue light actually can delay the onset of sleep by about 45 minutes. And that's even an e-book, so something like a Kindle, which we don't even think of as having, you know, light emitting, but even that can delay by about 45 minutes. So again, in an ideal world, what you would say is you would never have a device in the bedroom at all. So, you know, at least an hour to 2 hours before you're going to sleep, the devices. And if you want to read, because reading actually is quite a good soporific because of the saccades, the eye movements, go back to old paper versions. Yeah.
Thank you.
Publishers love me when I say that. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe take one last question, I think. Was there a question over there? Yep.
I'm not running off anywhere, so if anybody's got a burning question, please grab me afterwards.
Hi, Steve Bennington. I'm an intensive care consultant. With a power nap, it sounds like a good idea, but how long does it take someone to wake up and be cognitively well? So if you're the registrar in our unit and a tube falls out and you're having your nap, and it's quite a technical skill getting it back in, have you got a lag period when you wouldn't be performing well?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really good point. And yes, there is a lag period, and that lag period is determined by when you wake up in that sleep cycle. So if you're having a nap and you're in light sleep, the lag period is very short. Think about when you wake up in the morning, a couple of minutes, you probably, particularly if the adrenaline's pumping, you're there. If you get woken up in the nap and you're in deep sleep, then that lag period can actually be quite significant. It can be 10, 15 minutes, if not even longer. It's very individual, and it depends on where you are in that cycle. And that, of course, is the problem with napping if you're on call, is that there's always a danger that you're having a really good sleep and you're in deep sleep, and then you have got that time. So it is individual, and it depends where you're in the curve. So unfortunately, there's kind of no scientific answer, but it is a really important consideration.
Can I just ask one follow-on to that?
Of course.
So practically, it'd be difficult for the senior on the shift to have a power nap if you were thinking about patient safety. Is there any evidence that if you're having naps through the night, does that then stop you having a nice uninterrupted sleep in the day the following day? So is there an argument that actually, if you don't have naps, you might get 8 hours of sleep in the day if you can discipline yourself to do that?
Yes, absolutely. So there's two things there. It depends when you have the nap. So if you're on a night shift and you nap in the second half of the night, close to when you'll be going home to sleep, it is likely to disrupt the sleep, yes, because your drive for sleep will be reduced, you'll be less tired, and you're already fighting a losing battle because you're going to sleep in the middle of the day. So actually reducing your drive for sleep will impact the ability to get your 8 hours. If you have it in the first half of the night, it's less likely to have that effect. And also napping in the first half of the night, you're more likely to get deep sleep because that's when you get the most deep sleep anyway. And the research shows that actually increases performance, increases attention, and the kind of restorative effects. So a nap just before you come on shift and a nap in the first half of the night are the perfect times.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Vicki, and thanks for all those,
My absolute pleasure.
those questions. Thank you.